Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to an era of empires, industry, and immense, world-altering change. We're going to Imperial Germany just before the storm of the First World War breaks. But we're not going to be focusing on the Kaiser or the generals. Our story is about the silent partners of this empire, its women. Before 1914, a German woman's world was meant to be small, defined by a simple, powerful slogan: Kinder, Kuch, Kirch asterisk. Children, kitchen, church. This phrase, often attributed to Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, wasn't just a saying. It was a blueprint for an entire gender's existence. It described a life lived within the four walls of the home, a life dedicated to raising devout children, maintaining a pristine household, and upholding the moral and religious fabric of the nation. It was a world where a woman's value was measured by her husband's comfort and the number of sons she could provide for the fatherland. For centuries, this was the accepted order. A woman's life was dictated by her father, then her husband. She was expected to be a pillar of domestic stability, a quiet helpmate to the men who engaged in the real work of politics, industry, and public life. Legally, she was subordinate. In many parts of Germany, a married woman couldn't even work without her husband's permission. Her role was to be the steady, invisible heartbeat of the home, while men were the public face of the German Empire. But don't let that tidy slogan fool you. The Germany of the early 20th century was not a monolith of quiet domesticity. Under the surface, things were stirring. The Industrial Revolution had drawn more women from lower-class families into factories, especially in textiles, where they worked long, grueling hours for a fraction of a man's pay. And a vibrant, determined women's movement was gaining momentum. Groups like the Federation of German Women's Associations, or BDF, were campaigning not for radical equality, but for tangible rights, access to higher education, professional opportunities, and most importantly, the right to vote. Women like Anita Augsburg, Germany's first female university graduate, and the fiery socialist Clara Zetkin were challenging the very foundations of the patriarchal order. They held rallies, they published articles, and they dreamed of a world beyond the 3Ks. By 1911, over 1 million women were taking to the streets to demand suffrage. It was a quiet revolution, a slow burn of defiance against a system that saw them as secondary. Still, for the vast majority of German women in the summer of 1914, life was a cycle of domestic duties. They were daughters, wives, and mothers, their ambitions confined by societal expectation and law. The prevailing belief was that political thinking simply wasn't in a woman's nature. Their world was the home. And then, in August of 1914, that world was shattered. The assassination of an archduke in a city many Germans couldn't even place on a map spiraled into a global conflict. Millions of men, husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers, donned the Feldgrau asterisk, the field gray uniforms of the Imperial German Army, and marched off to what they were promised would be a short, glorious war. They left behind fields unplowed, factories unmanned, and a society suddenly, terrifyingly hollowed out. In that deafening silence, a question arose, unspoken at first, but growing with every train that pulled away from the station. Who would keep the nation running? The answer, as Germany was about to discover, was its women. The sudden vacuum of men didn't just create a need, it created an opportunity. The war would demand more from German women than they could ever have imagined, pushing them far beyond the confines of children, kitchen, and church, and into roles that would change their lives, and Germany itself forever. Hey guys, and welcome back. In the summer of 1914, a wave of patriotic fever swept across the German Empire, a phenomenon that would become known as the Spirit of 1914. While history often focuses on the young men marching off to the front, the women they left behind were caught up in this nationalistic tide, playing a crucial and deeply emotional role in those early, fervent days of the war. Forget the idea of passive bystanders. German women were active, vocal participants in the war's dramatic opening act. Imagine the scenes in Berlin, Munich, or Hamburg in August 1914. The streets are overflowing with people. Military music blares from marching bands, and the air is thick with the scent of flowers and the sound of cheering crowds. Trains, packed with soldiers in their new field gray uniforms, are pulling away from the stations. And on those platforms, amidst the chaos and the steam, are the women. Mothers, wives, sisters, and sweethearts, their faces a complex mixture of pride, fear, and patriotic resolve. They press flowers, chocolates, and small prayer books into the hands of their departing men. They wave handkerchiefs until the trains are nothing but a wisp of smoke in the distance. This wasn't just a quiet farewell. It was a public performance of national unity. In these moments, personal grief was overshadowed by a powerful, collective sense of duty and sacrifice for the fatherland. This outpouring of support wasn't entirely spontaneous. It was nurtured and channeled by a network of women's organizations that sprang into action the moment war was declared. Groups like the conservative, Patriotic Women's Association called on their members to join the national struggle, framing their support as a sacred duty. But the real organizational powerhouse was the Bund Deutscher Frauenverein Asterisk, or the Federation of German Women's Associations. This umbrella group, representing the more middle-class, bourgeois women's movement, immediately set aside its pre-war struggles for suffrage and legal rights. The fight for female emancipation was paused. The fight for Germany had begun. In a remarkable display of unity, these groups came together to form the Asterisk Nationaler Frauendienst, NFD, or the National Women's Service, in August 1914. Led by Gertrude Beimer, this organization was a massive, coordinated effort to manage the home front. For the first time in German history, women from liberal, conservative, and even social democratic backgrounds officially collaborated on a national level, putting aside deep-seated political differences for the common cause. The NFD was seen as nothing less than a national defense effort. Its volunteers, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were driven by a potent mix of enthusiasm and patriotism that defined the early war period. They didn't see their work as charity. They saw it, as one prominent woman put it, as our military service. This service took many forms. NFD volunteers set up soup kitchens, provided aid to soldiers' families, cared for refugees, and organized childcare for mothers who were suddenly the sole providers. They saw themselves as the Asterisk Kulturträgerinnen Asterisk, the guardians of German culture and spiritual values, defending the honor of their men who were being accused of atrocities in Belgium and France. It was a way for them to carve out a distinctly female space within the male-dominated machinery of war. The ultimate symbol of this patriotic sacrifice came in the form of the Gold gab ich für Eisen, or I Gave Gold for Iron campaign. This was a nationwide fundraising effort where citizens were urged to donate their gold jewelry to finance the war. In exchange, a woman who gave up her gold wedding band would receive a simple iron ring in return, often inscribed with the patriotic phrase. Wearing this iron ring became a greater status symbol than wearing gold. It was a visible, tangible sign that you were not only wealthy enough to have gold to give, but that you were also a patriot, a woman who had sacrificed her personal treasures for the good of the nation. It was the ultimate expression of the belief that every citizen, male or female, had a part to play in achieving victory. And in those early days, victory felt not just possible, but inevitable. The cheers at the train stations were for a war they believed would be over by Christmas, a short, heroic adventure that would elevate Germany to its rightful place in the world. The women waving goodbye were not just sending their men to fight, they were launching them towards a glorious destiny they all believed in. But as the trains disappeared over the horizon, and the initial wave of euphoria began to fade, they were left to confront a new, and much harsher, reality. As the cannons of the Great War began their insatiable feast on men and metal, a different kind of army was being conscripted back in the German homeland. An army without uniforms, without rifles, but whose labor was just as crucial to the war machine as any soldier in a trench. This was the army of women, and their battlefield was the factory floor. Before 1914, the world of heavy industry, especially armaments production, was a fortress of masculinity. The great industrial titans like Krupp, the steel heart of the German war effort, employed almost no women. The clatter of machinery, the smell of hot metal, the sheer physical force required, it was all considered men's work. A woman's place, according to the rigid social order of Imperial Germany, was in the asterisk Küche, kinder Kirch asterisk, kitchen, children, church. Her hands were meant for kneading dough, not for shaping artillery shells. But war changes everything. As millions of men marched away, leaving their workbenches and lathes silent, the factories fell quiet. And a quiet factory produces no bullets. A silent foundry forges no cannons. The German High Command, initially confident of a swift, decisive victory, soon faced a terrifying reality. Modern warfare was a voracious monster, consuming munitions at a rate no one had ever imagined. Suddenly, the theories about female fragility and unsuitability for industrial labor were thrown overboard. Necessity, that most unsentimental of recruiters, came knocking on the doors of German homes. And women answered the call. They streamed out of domestic service, left their posts as shop girls and laundresses, and walked through the gates of factories that had once been forbidden territory. They came for many reasons. For patriotism, stirred by the relentless propaganda, but also for survival. With husbands, fathers, and brothers at the front, and with military allowances proving painfully inadequate, a factory wage, however meager compared to a man's, was often the only thing standing between a family and starvation. This was the birth of the munitionette asterisk, the German equivalent of the British munitionettes. From just a handful before the war, their numbers swelled. By 1917, women made up nearly a third of the 175,000 workers at Krupp alone. Nationwide, nearly 1.4 million German women were drafted into the war labor force. It was a staggering, unprecedented shift. The kitchen had been traded for the crucible of Krupp. Imagine that transition. One day, you're navigating the familiar geography of your home, the scent of baking bread in the air. The next, you're stepping into a cavernous hall filled with a deafening roar that vibrates through the soles of your shoes. The air is thick with the acrid smell of chemicals and hot oil. You're surrounded by monolithic machinery you don't know the name of, performing tasks that feel alien and dangerous. This wasn't just a new job, it was a new world, and it was a world fraught with peril. The work was relentless, often organized into grueling 12-hour shifts that ran day and night. The sheer physical labor was backbreaking, lifting heavy shells, operating complex lathes, and enduring the monotonous, repetitive motions of the assembly line. But the exhaustion was the least of their worries. The real danger was woven into the very air they breathed and the materials they touched. The women worked with trinitrotoluene, or TNT, the highly toxic explosive compound used to fill shells. Protective gear was primitive at best, often non-existent. Women handled the hazardous yellow powder with their bare hands. Soon, a grim transformation began. The TNT dust settled on their skin and hair, turning it a sickly, jaundiced yellow. This telltale sign earned munitions workers in Britain the nickname Canary Girls. And while the term isn't as commonly associated with the German asterisk munitionette asterisk, the chemical reaction was identical. It was a visible badge of their dangerous trade, a stain that marked them both inside and out. The constant exposure led to devastating health problems, liver failure, anemia, and severe damage to the immune system. They were literally poisoning themselves to produce the weapons of war. And then there was the ever-present threat of explosion. The factories were volatile powder kegs. A single stray spark, a dropped tool, a moment of carelessness could trigger a cataclysm. The rules were draconian to prevent such disasters. Workers were forbidden from bringing in anything metal, hairpins, buttons, even the metal clasps on corsets. They were searched daily. Yet, despite the precautions, accidents happened. Explosions ripped through factories, claiming hundreds of lives, though the exact numbers were often suppressed by the government to avoid damaging public morale. For the munitionette asterisk, every day was a gamble. They were soldiers on a home front that could be just as deadly as the one in Flanders. They weren't just making munitions, they were living inside them. While the men were away fighting in the trenches, a different kind of war was being waged back home in Germany. A war of attrition, fought not with bullets and bayonets, but with empty cupboards, rumbling stomachs, and freezing homes. This was the war on the home front. And its soldiers were overwhelmingly women. And no period tested their resolve more than the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1916-1917, a a time that would be seared into the collective memory as the Steckrubenwinter asterisk, the turnip winter. Imagine waking up not to the smell of coffee or baking bread, but to the damp, bone-chilling cold of a home with no coal for the stove. The silence of the morning is broken only by the gnawing ache in your stomach, a familiar companion that never truly leaves. For the women of Germany, this was the dawn of a new reality. The Allied naval blockade, a stranglehold on German ports, had cut off vital imports. Food, which had once been plentiful, became a ghost. The 1916 potato harvest, a staple of the German diet, failed disastrously due to a combination of heavy autumn rains and a blight. With potatoes gone, the government turned to a desperate substitute, the lowly turnip, or more accurately, the rutabaga. This tough, unloved root vegetable became the centerpiece of nearly every meal. Women, who had once prided themselves on hearty family dinners, were now forced into a grim culinary experiment. How many ways could you prepare a turnip? They made turnip soup, turnip bread bulked out with sawdust, turnip jam sweetened with saccharin, even turnip coffee brewed from roasted peels. The taste was earthy, bitter, and monotonous, a constant reminder of their deprivation. Every meal was a battle against malnutrition and despair, a testament to a woman's sheer ingenuity in the face of starvation. The state stepped in with rationing, but it was a chaotic and often cruel system. Ration cards were introduced, promising meager portions of bread, meat, and fat that rarely materialized. A typical weekly ration for an adult in Berlin might consist of a few pounds of bread made with more potato and rye substitutes than actual flour, a few ounces of meat that was mostly bone and gristle, and a sliver of fat or butter. Sugar was a luxury, eggs a distant memory. The queues, the endless, shuffling lines outside bakeries and butcher shops, became a defining feature of daily life. Women would stand for hours, sometimes from before dawn in the freezing cold, often only to be told that the day's supply had run out. These lines became hotbeds of rumor, frustration, and a simmering collective anger. Fights would break out, fueled by hunger and the injustice of seeing the wealthy. It was rumored, still able to find food on the black market. This was a woman's work. Managing the ration cards for the entire family, stretching microscopic portions to feed children and the elderly, and venturing into the countryside on hamstering expeditions, dangerous foraging trips to barter with farmers for a few extra potatoes or a bit of flour. They would trade precious household items, a wedding band, a silver locket, for a sack of vegetables, risking arrest and fines for circumventing the official rationing system. Their children's health was a constant, gnawing worry. With milk and fat so scarce, infant mortality rates soared. Children grew up pale and listless, their bodies stunted by what became known as war-bred disease, a painful digestive ailment caused by the indigestible fillers in their food. A mother's heart broke with every cry of hunger she could not satisfy, every cough she could not soothe with a warm, nourishing meal. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological strain was just as corrosive. The constant anxiety over food, the gnawing hunger, the freezing cold, and the endless, exhausting work chipped away at their spirit. Yet they endured. They became masters of making something from nothing, of patching clothes until they were more patch than fabric, of keeping a semblance of normalcy for their children in a world that had lost all reason. They read letters from the front with a mix of love and dread, and wrote back with forced cheerfulness, hiding the grim reality of the turnip winter so as not to break the morale of their husbands and sons in the trenches. They were fighting on two fronts, one against the enemy abroad, and a far more intimate one against the starvation within their own homes. The turnip winter was not a single event. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, and at its heart were the women who stared into the abyss of hunger every single day and somehow, against all odds, found the strength to survive. While the men of the German Empire marched toward the front in a surge of patriotic fervor, another army was mobilizing in their wake. An army without rifles or bayonets, but one that would face the grim realities of the conflict just as intimately. When German men received their calls to mobilize, so too did a select group of women. They were the Schwestern Asterisk, the sisters of the German Red Cross, and for them, the war meant a sacred, terrifying duty was about to begin. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic rush of untrained volunteers. Germany, having learned hard lessons in its previous wars, had been preparing for this moment for years. The German Red Cross, working hand in glove with the military authorities, had a vast, semi-official system ready to deploy. It was a complex tapestry of organizations: devout Catholic nursing orders, Protestant deaconesses operating out of hierarchical motherhouses, and the professional nurses of the Red Cross sisterhoods. Within a staggering 48 hours after the call for mobilization, 5,000 graduate Red Cross nurses, women who had been working professionally in civilian hospitals, reported for duty, ready to be dispatched into the storm. They were joined by tens of thousands more. There were the auxiliary nurses, with half a year's training, and the nurses' aides, who had received as little as 6 weeks of instruction in practical and theoretical courses. Some of these aides, caught up in the initial patriotic wave, saw the work as a kind of fashionable fad and quickly dropped out when confronted with the horrific reality. But many stayed, their brief training hardened into expertise by a few months of unrelenting work, eventually earning them promotion to the rank of auxiliary sister. From 1914 to 1918, a staggering force of over 92,000 German Red Cross women would be involved in nursing. The vast majority, more than 73,000, would serve on the home front in the Vaterland asterisk. But over 19,000 would be sent to the rear echelons, into the belly of the war machine, just behind the front lines. Unlike their British counterparts who sometimes set up their own independent dressing stations, the German system was rigid and controlled. All military nursing had to be done under the official umbrella of the Red Cross. These women weren't just volunteers. They were cogs in a meticulously planned, state-sanctioned medical response, about to witness a scale of suffering humanity had never before conceived. For the nurses sent behind the front, life was a descent into a gray, methodical hell. They were not stationed in the mud of the trenches themselves, but in the sprawling network of clearing stations, field hospitals, and base hospitals that formed the next ring of suffering. These were often makeshift facilities set up in captured chateaus, schools, or cavernous tents, perpetually under the distant, rumbling threat of artillery shelling. The work was a relentless tide of broken bodies. They staffed the hospital trains, the so-called red trains, where a single nurse could be responsible for the care of up to 20 severely wounded men as the train rattled its way back toward Germany. Imagine the scene: rows of groaning men on stretchers, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, blood, and antiseptic, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant drumbeat beneath a symphony of pain. In the hospitals, the conditions were even more intense. They were confronted not just with the shrapnel and bullet wounds they had been trained for, but with the terrifying new weapons of modern warfare. The grotesque burns from flamethrowers, the shredded flesh from artillery, and the agonizing, unseen damage from poison gas. Beyond the wounds of combat, they battled relentless epidemics of infectious diseases like typhus and influenza, which swept through the crowded, unsanitary wards with lethal efficiency. One French nurse, working in a German-run hospital, described the overwhelming flood of casualties, with blood literally forming a stream down the stairs and pooling at the foot of the beds, the staff too overwhelmed to even clean it up. The women who wrote about their experiences during the war often painted a sanitized, optimistic picture in their diaries, focusing on interesting foreign sights and the well-organized care, reassuring the public back home. They wrote of the soldiers being in good spirits, eager to return to the fight. But the memoirs published years later, after 1933, told a different, more brutal story. They spoke of the chaotic medical arrangements, the constant shortages, and the sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion of their work, especially on the less modernized Eastern Front. This was the hidden reality behind the propaganda image of the serene, motherly angel in gray. While thousands served near the front, the vast majority of Germany's wartime nurses fought their battle on home soil. This was the other front line, the one in the fatherland. Here, in towns and cities across Germany, schools, university halls, and public buildings were hastily converted into military hospitals, or lazaret. In the first months of the war, the system was chaotic, overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded men returning from the fronts. But soon, the combined efforts of the military and the Red Cross doubled the number of available beds, creating a vast network of care that stretched across the entire country. Life here was a different kind of grueling. The nurses on the home front didn't hear the artillery, but they saw its results, day after day, as train after train arrived, disgorging its cargo of broken men. They dealt with the long-term consequences, the amputees learning to navigate a world without limbs, the soldiers blinded by gas, the men suffering from shell shock, a condition little understood and often dismissed. They cared for soldiers through countless surgeries, fought infections in a pre-antibiotic age, and sat with the dying, often writing letters home to families who had no idea their son was gone. Their duty also extended beyond German soldiers. They cared for Allied prisoners of war, adhering to the Red Cross principle of impartial, neutral care for all wounded, regardless of nationality. This was a complex and often fraught responsibility. While some Allied accounts from prisoners praised the professionalism of the German nurses who treated them, a powerful counter-narrative of cruelty emerged in Allied propaganda. These accusations, however, likely stemmed from British POWs confusing the trained Red Cross nurses with members of other patriotic women's associations who served refreshments at train stations and sometimes treated prisoners with contempt. In reality, many German nurses upheld their humanitarian duty, with some even traveling into enemy territory in Russia to visit and care for German prisoners of war held there. Their service was not without ultimate sacrifice. The story of these women has been largely overlooked, overshadowed by the narratives of their Allied counterparts. But they paid a heavy price. At least 105 German nurses were killed by bombing raids, and another 246 died from the diseases they fought so hard to contain in their wards. These women, the angels in gray, were not passive observers of the conflict. They were at its very heart, fighting a relentless, exhausting, and heartbreaking war against death itself, both on the doorstep of the battlefield and deep within the wounded fatherland. While the factories churned out shells and steel, a different kind of battle was being waged on the streets, in the fields, and along the quiet residential lanes of Germany. This wasn't a fight with weapons, but with exhaustion, with scarcity, and with the crushing weight of keeping a nation alive. The women who fought this battle weren't soldiers, but they were the lifeblood of the home front. Their work wasn't glorious, but without it, the entire German war machine would have ground to a halt. Imagine, for a moment, the clang and screech of a tramcar rattling through the cobblestone streets of Berlin in 1916. For generations, the figure at the controls had been a man, sturdy, uniformed, a symbol of industrial order. But now, as the tram lurches to a stop, the face that peers out from under the conductor's cap is a woman's. This was a sight that was both shocking and suddenly, profoundly normal. With the cities drained of men, public transport, the very circulatory system of urban life, was on the verge of collapse. So women were recruited, put through hurried training courses, and handed the controls of these heavy, groaning machines. The public reaction was a curious mix of necessity and novelty. Periodicals of the time wrote humorous poems about the new asterisk Straßenbahnfahrerin asterisk, the female tram conductor. They noted her charm and her smile, a gentle presence in place of the usual gruff, bulky man. This wasn't just a job. It was a performance of patriotic duty, wrapped in an attempt to preserve the ideals of femininity even while doing men's work. For the first time, many of these women wore official uniforms, a visible symbol of their new state-sanctioned role in the public sphere. But don't mistake the gentle descriptions for an easy reality. These women worked long, grueling hours, navigating crowded streets filled with tension and anxiety, responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers each day. They were keeping the cities moving, ensuring that the workers who remained could get to their jobs, that the gears of the wartime economy, however strained, could still turn. Now, let's leave the noise of the city behind and travel out into the vast, silent landscapes of the German countryside. Here, an even more fundamental struggle was taking place. Before the war, the rhythm of rural life was dictated by the seasons and the labor of men. But with the men, and even the horses conscripted for the front, A profound silence fell over the millions of small farms that fed the nation. A silence that was filled by the solitary, backbreaking work of the asterisk Bayurinnen asterisk, the farmers' wives and daughters. They weren't just helping out, they were taking over completely. Picture a lone woman, her husband's last letter tucked away, guiding a plow behind a slow-moving ox because the horses were gone. She was planting, weeding, and harvesting, often by hand, in a desperate race against time and starvation. The Allied naval blockade meant Germany was cut off, forced to feed its army and its people with only what it could grow itself. The pressure on these women was biblical. They battled not only the soil and the weather, but also shortages of fertilizer and equipment, which caused crop yields to fall year after year. Many relied on detailed, handwritten instructions mailed from the trenches, their husbands trying to manage the farm from hundreds of miles away. This was a relentless, isolating existence. Their labor was the only thing standing between Germany and mass starvation, yet their contribution was often seen as secondary, a domestic duty rather than the vital national service it truly was. They were the forgotten soldiers in the war against hunger. And as these women toiled in the fields, another group was quietly connecting the fractured soul of the nation. Back in the cities and towns, the arrival of the mail carrier was the most emotionally charged moment of the day. And increasingly, that mail carrier was a woman. The Feldpost asterisk, or military mail service, was more than just a delivery system. It was described as the social glue of the wartime society. It was the only bridge connecting the millions of fathers, husbands, and sons at the front with the families they had left behind. These new asterisk postbetinnen asterisk, female postal workers, became the bearers of this immense emotional weight. Their satchels were filled with the lifeblood of morale, letters promising a return, describing the mundane details of life in a trench, or simply offering a sign of life. They delivered packages from home containing small comforts, food, tobacco, hand-knitted socks. But their arrival was also laced with dread. Every family watched them approach with a mix of hope and fear. Because these women also had the grim task of returning letters to the sender, stamped with a single, brutal word, Gefallen asterisk. Fallen. They were the ones who often delivered the first, unofficial notice that a son or husband was never coming home. The tram drivers, the farmers, the postal workers, they weren't making bullets or firing guns, but they were holding Germany together at its seams. They kept the cities functioning, they kept the nation fed, and they maintained the fragile, vital lines of communication that kept hope from dying entirely. They stepped out of their homes and into the very fabric of the nation's infrastructure, becoming the quiet, indispensable engine of the home front. While Germany, as the cannons roared across Europe, another, quieter war was being waged on the home front, a war for the hearts and minds of the German people. And at the center of this battle stood a powerful, carefully crafted figure, the ideal German war mother. She wasn't just a woman. She was a symbol, a pillar of the nation's strength, her image plastered on posters and her virtues extolled in speeches. She was serene, sacrificial, and utterly devoted to the fatherland. German propaganda took a decidedly traditional approach, portraying women not as adventurous figures, but as dutiful mothers and wives, the stoic heart of the nation. Their role was to serve, to endure, and to support the war effort in any way possible. This wasn't about glamour or excitement. It was about consensus, unity, and a deep-seated sense of patriotic duty. The posters didn't depict voluptuous women luring men to enlist, as seen in some Allied propaganda. Instead, they showed solemn families, mothers holding bobbies, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and unwavering resolve. The message was clear. The man's heroism was on the battlefield, but the woman's was in her eternal patient devotion, in ever-patient sorrow and endurance. One of the most potent ways this ideal was reinforced was through the concept of material sacrifice. Women were called upon to give up everything for the war effort, from their time to their most precious possessions. The famous Gold gab ich für Eisen, or I gave gold for iron campaign was a masterstroke of propaganda. Originating during the Napoleonic Wars, it was revived with incredible success during World War I. Women were urged to turn in their gold jewelry. Wedding rings, necklaces, heirlooms, in exchange for iron replicas, often inscribed with the patriotic phrase. This wasn't just about financing the war. It was about creating a visible symbol of patriotism. Wearing an iron ring became a greater status symbol than wearing gold. A public declaration that you were a true patriot who had sacrificed for the fatherland. The social pressure was immense. A woman adorned in gold was seen as selfish, her loyalty questioned, while the woman with the simple iron brooch was hailed as a hero of the home front. Propaganda posters hammered this message home, like one depicting a German warpan with the inscription, "She gave copper away for iron," celebrating the housewife's sense of sacrifice. Beyond material goods, the ultimate sacrifice was, of course, her sons. The war mother was expected to bravely send her husband and sons off to the front, to bear the unbearable loss with quiet dignity. She was the guardian of the home, raising the next generation of soldiers and instilling in them a love for the nation. In this way, her role transcended the domestic sphere and became a vital component of the state's war machine. Her body, her choices, and her grief were no longer her own. They belonged to Germany. She was the perfect woman, forged in the fires of war, silent, strong, and endlessly sacrificial. While the initial patriotic fervor of 1914 swept millions of German women into the war effort, a powerful, albeit smaller, chorus of dissenting voices rose to challenge the conflict, the government, and the very fabric of German society. These were the women who risked their freedom, reputations, and lives to stand against the tide of nationalism and militarism. At the forefront of this intellectual and political resistance was a figure of extraordinary brilliance and unyielding conviction, Rosa Luxemburg. Even before the first shots were fired, Rosa Luxemburg was a titan of the European socialist movement, a Polish Jewish intellectual who had become a leading and often radical voice in Germany's Social Democratic Party, SPD. She was a fierce and uncompromising critic of imperialism and militarism. She viewed the impending conflict not as a noble defense of the fatherland, but as a cynical power struggle between capitalist empires, a war that would inevitably force the working classes to slaughter one another for the profits of the elite. When Germany declared war in August 1914, her worst fears were realized. The turning point for her was the SPD's decision to support war credits, effectively writing a blank check for the conflict. To Luxemburg, this was a profound and unforgivable betrayal of the core tenets of international socialism. This act of political capitulation galvanized her. While former comrades were swept up in the patriotic fervor, Luxemburg, alongside a small group of like-minded radicals including Karl Liebknecht and Clara Zetkin, broke away to form what would become the Spartacus League. This underground organization was dedicated to a seemingly impossible goal, ending the war through a popular revolution. Luxemburg's primary weapon was her formidable intellect, channeled into razor-sharp prose. Through smuggled pamphlets, clandestine meetings, and defiant speeches, she sought to dismantle the government's war propaganda piece by piece. She wrote not of glorious charges and heroic sacrifices, but of shattered bodies, grieving families, and the gnawing hunger that was beginning to cripple the German home front. "The dividends are rising," she famously wrote, "and the proletarians are falling." Her unwavering opposition made her a public enemy. The German government, determined to maintain national unity and crush any dissent, saw her as a dangerous agitator. In February 1915, she was arrested and imprisoned for her anti-war activities. Yet, a prison cell could not contain her spirit or silence her pen. From behind bars, she continued to write prolifically, smuggling out articles and letters that would become some of the most influential anti-war literature of the era. Her most celebrated work from this period, the Junius pamphlet, was a scathing and brilliant indictment of the war and the socialist leaders who had enabled it. Written in secret on flimsy paper, it was passed from hand to hand by her supporters, its words fanning the embers of resistance across a weary nation. But Rosa Luxemburg's intellectual dissent was not the only form of female protest. As the war dragged on, turning years into a bloody stalemate, a different kind of resistance began to brew, born not of political theory, but of visceral desperation. The British naval blockade had effectively sealed Germany off from the world, choking off vital imports and leading to catastrophic food shortages. The winter of 1916-1917 became infamous as the Turnip Winter, a period of profound suffering when the German people were forced to survive on little more than turnips as staples like potatoes and bread vanished. It was the women who bore the heaviest burden. They were the ones who managed the household economies, who stood for countless hours in freezing queues, often to find the shelves bare. They were the ones who had to quiet the cries of hungry children while their husbands and sons were dying at the front. And it was these women who began to spontaneously take to the streets. Their protests were not initially organized by political parties. They were raw, desperate outpourings of anger and despair. These were the hunger riots, led by mothers and wives who had reached their breaking point. These demonstrations began as small-scale disturbances in market squares and in front of bakeries, with women demanding bread and peace. But they quickly grew in size, frequency, and intensity. In major industrial centers like Berlin, Hamburg, and Leipzig, thousands of women marched, sometimes smashing windows and clashing with police forces. These were not revolutionaries in the mold of Rosa Luxemburg, yet their actions were profoundly radical. In a patriarchal society that demanded their silent sacrifice for the nation, their public fury was a powerful act of defiance. They were directly challenging the state's ability to provide for its citizens, and by extension, its legitimacy to continue waging the war. The authorities often responded with force, arresting protesters and publicly dismissing them as hysterical housewives who lacked patriotic discipline. But the unrest was too widespread to ignore. The women's protests were a clear and alarming signal that the social fabric of the home front was tearing apart. Their chants for Brot und Frieden, bread and peace, became a powerful rallying cry for a burgeoning anti-war movement. They organized strikes in the munitions factories, the very heart of the war machine they were meant to be fueling. In 1917 and 1918, massive waves of strikes rolled across Germany, with hundreds of thousands of workers walking off the job, a significant number of them women. These actions crippled war production and sent an unmistakable message to the leadership in Berlin. The people's capacity for suffering was not infinite. The voices of dissent, from the eloquent fury of Rosa Luxemburg in her prison cell to the desperate cries of hungry women in the streets, were instrumental in the eventual end of the war. They relentlessly exposed the chasm between wartime propaganda and the lived reality of the German people. While Luxemburg and the Spartacists dreamed of a grand socialist revolution, the women in the food queues fought for a more immediate goal: the survival of their families. Together, these disparate forms of protest eroded the foundations of the German war effort, fueling the widespread disillusionment that would culminate in the collapse of the monarchy and the signing of the armistice in November 1918. They proved that even in the darkest of times, the courage to demand peace, to protest injustice, and to envision a different world could not be completely extinguished. As millions of men marched away to the thunder of the front, they left behind a silence in Germany's cities and villages. But this silence was deceptive. It was filled with the hum of new machinery operated by women, the chatter of women in public spaces once dominated by men, and the anxious whispers of a society terrified of what might happen when its women were left, unsupervised. The new economic and social freedoms granted to German women weren't universally celebrated as a sign of progress. For many, they were a terrifying symptom of a world turned upside down, a crack in the very foundation of the nation's moral order. While men faced the enemy abroad, a different kind of war was declared at home, a war on female independence and so-called loose morals. Suddenly, with husbands, fathers, and brothers gone, millions of women were managing households, finances, and their own lives with an unprecedented degree of autonomy. And for the guardians of tradition, the church, conservative politicians, and much of the general public, this was a recipe for disaster. A deep-seated moral panic began to simmer, fueled by the fear that without a male presence to guide and control them, women would inevitably fall into moral decay. The soldier's wife, the Kriegerfrau*, was placed on a pedestal. She was meant to be a patriotic icon of chaste devotion, patiently waiting for her heroic husband. But this pedestal was also a prison of intense scrutiny. Her every move was watched. Neighborhood rumor mills worked overtime, and any deviation from the ideal, a friendly conversation with another man, a new dress, a visit to a cafe, could be twisted into evidence of infidelity. Soldiers at the front, fed a diet of letters and gossip, became consumed with paranoia about what their wives were doing back home. This anxiety created a profound and damaging rift between the front and the home front, a chasm of suspicion that strained marriages to the breaking point. The most potent accusation that could be leveled against a woman was that of sexual treason. In the feverish atmosphere of total war, a woman's body was no longer her own. It was a symbol of the nation's purity. An act of infidelity wasn't just a personal betrayal of a husband. It was seen as a treacherous act against the fatherland itself, a stain on the honor of the men sacrificing their lives in the trenches. This panic reached its zenith in the hysteria surrounding relationships between German women and prisoners of war. These men, the enemy, were living and working in Germany, and any interaction was viewed with profound suspicion. Women who formed relationships with POWs were seen as the ultimate traitors. They were publicly shamed, their names sometimes printed in local newspapers, and they could face fines or even jail time for their perceived betrayal. The state itself became an arbiter of private morality, convinced that the average German could not be trusted to make the correct sexual decisions. This intervention was driven by a very practical fear: venereal disease. Military officials were terrified that soldiers on leave would contract diseases from immoral women and carry them back to the front, crippling the army's fighting strength. Women who could infect a soldier were seen as no different from spies or saboteurs, an enemy lurking behind the lines. This fear led to increased state surveillance and control over women's lives, as their private choices were reframed as matters of national security. It wasn't just about sexuality. The very image of the new, independent woman was a source of anxiety. Women were smoking and drinking in public, adopting what was considered male language, and wearing clothes that were less restrictive and, to conservative eyes, more provocative. The woman driving a tram or working a lathe was a necessary part of the war machine, but the woman who collected her own wages and spent them as she pleased was a threat to the traditional family structure. The alienation between spouses who were separated for years created a drive, particularly among women, for more independent lives, shaking the old patriarchal model of the family to its core. This moral panic wasn't just a fleeting wartime phenomenon. It was the dress rehearsal for the bitter culture wars that would define the post-war Weimar Republic. The anxieties about the independent new woman, the fears of declining birth rates and national degeneracy, and the obsession with female purity would all explode onto the political stage in the 1920s. The seeds of that conflict, between tradition and modernity, control and freedom, were sown in the factories and on the streets of wartime Germany, where women, for the first time, were beginning to imagine a world that wasn't defined by a man's return. While the image of the stoic Red Cross nurse, the Rotkreuzschwester asterisk, dominated the public perception of women's wartime service, another, far less celebrated group of women stepped into the machinery of the German war effort. They were not healers of bodies, but essential cogs in the vast, grinding gears of the military bureaucracy, a kind of shadow army that operated just behind the front lines. Officially, they were civilian employees. Unofficially, they became the Kaiser's Grey Army, a force whose very existence challenged the rigid gender roles of Imperial Germany. As the war bled into its third year, the German High Command faced a stark reality. They were running out of men. Every able-bodied soldier was needed in the trenches, yet the logistical tale of the army, the endless chains of communication, administration, and supply, was consuming thousands of troops who could otherwise be holding a rifle. The solution, born of pure necessity rather than any progressive ideal, was to bring in women. So, beginning in earnest around 1917, the German military began to recruit women for auxiliary service. These were not nurses. They were clerks, typists, telegraph operators, and telephone switchboard operators. Known as *Edipenhilferinnen*, or rear area auxiliaries. Their job was to take over the crucial but non-combat tasks in the occupied territories and staging areas behind the front. This move was unprecedented. It brought women, for the first time in an organized fashion, directly into the operational sphere of the German army. The recruitment effort, often organized by bourgeois women's associations, promised a new kind of opportunity. For many young women, especially from the lower middle classes, the call to serve was intoxicating. It offered a chance to escape the confines of domestic life, to earn a relatively good wage with decent food, a powerful incentive in a nation stalked by hunger, and to experience a degree of independence that was almost unthinkable in civilian life. Imagine being a young woman in 1917, your world defined by church, kitchen, and the prospect of a suitable marriage. Suddenly, an offer appears. Serve the fatherland, work alongside soldiers, live far from home, and be paid for it. It was a siren song of patriotic duty and personal liberation. By September of 1918, their numbers had swelled to over 17,000, making up nearly two-thirds of the personnel in certain re-echelon sectors. They became the nerve center of the Army's communication network, connecting generals to the front, transmitting orders, and processing the mountains of paperwork that any modern army generates. They worked in drafty, orderly rooms, in buzzing telegraph offices, and in makeshift headquarters set up in captured Belgian and French towns. But this new role came at a steep social cost. While the Red Cross nurse was elevated to an almost saintly status, a maternal, selfless sister to the wounded soldier, the asterisk Edepenhelferin was viewed with suspicion and scorn. Back home, and even among the soldiers they served, they were often depicted as morally loose adventurers. Vicious rumors circulated, branding them as officers' mattresses or women of questionable virtue who had only gone to the front for immoral reasons. This hostility stemmed from a deep-seated anxiety. These women weren't fitting into the accepted feminine role of caregivers. They were doing men's jobs. They were working in the military, a space that was considered the ultimate domain of masculinity. By their very presence, they threatened to blur the sacred line between the masculine front and the feminine home front, a dichotomy that wartime society desperately clung to. They were an uncomfortable reminder that the old order was breaking down under the immense pressure of total war. Soldiers at the rear, fearful of being replaced by these women and sent into the meat grinder of the trenches, often treated them with resentment. The auxiliaries were seen not as patriots, but as unwelcome competitors who were potentially lengthening the war by freeing up more men to fight it. And so, this forgotten army of women carried a double burden: the strain of their vital work and the stigma of public disapproval. They served without the honor afforded to nurses, and without the recognition that would come to female auxiliaries in later conflicts. They were the gray figures in the background of a global catastrophe, essential yet invisible, their contributions quietly erased from the heroic narrative of the war, leaving behind only the faintest echo of their service. For the millions beyond the clamor of the factories and the stoic silence of the fields, a different kind of war was being waged, a quiet, internal battle fought in the hearts of millions of German women. This was a war of nerve-shredding anxiety, of hope and dread, played out in the space between letters, in the silences that stretched for weeks, and in the devastating finality of a single, black-edged envelope. For every soldier in the trenches, there was a woman at home, suspended in an abyss of waiting. Their primary, and often only, connection to the front was the Feldpost asterisk, the military mail service. It was an emotional lifeline, a fragile thread connecting two worlds. A letter arriving, bearing the familiar handwriting of a husband, a son, or a brother, was a moment of profound relief, a confirmation that for one more day he was alive. Women would gather, sharing news, reading letters aloud. The good news a communal joy, the lack of news a shared burden. One woman, who carefully saved every letter in a fabric-covered box, explained her devotion simply. "Those are all of my love letters. I took this box along down to the cellar during every bomb attack." For her, these paper scraps were more valuable than any physical possession. They were the tangible proof of a life, a love, a reason to endure. But this lifeline was fraught with peril. The mail was censored, and the authorities actively encouraged women to become soldiers on the emotional front. Propaganda urged them to write only cheerful, encouraging letters. In a 1916 treatise titled The German Woman's Trench, Melita von Rundstedt declared, "A letter can easily make a man a hero or a coward. Therefore, I would urge you, women of Germany, always to write only letters of a sunny nature to the front." Women were told their words had the power to fortify the nation's morale. Complaining about shortages, loneliness, or fear was seen as a betrayal, a weakening of the national will. So they wrote of small domestic triumphs, of the children's latest antics, of their unwavering pride. They packed parcels with dwindling supplies, sending a taste of home to a world of mud and steel. But beneath this veneer of patriotic duty, a current of desperate anxiety flowed. In the privacy of their diaries, and in the coded language of their letters, the true emotional cost becomes visible. "The uncertainty is the worst," wrote one woman, desperate for news of her husband's whereabouts. This gnawing uncertainty was a constant companion. A delayed letter could mean anything: a transfer, a disruption in the mail service, or the unthinkable. Every knock on the door could be the telegram boy. As one journalist of the time recalled, when he would call on homes, a woman would gasp, frightened, thinking I might have been the telegraph boy with some bad news. And then, for hundreds of thousands of them, the waiting would end in the worst way imaginable. By the war's end, Germany would count over 500,000 war widows. The arrival of the official notification of death was a moment that shattered worlds. For the artist Keth Kollwitz, the loss of her younger son, Peter, on the battlefields of Belgium in 1914 was a wound that would never heal. "There is in our lives a wound which will never heal, nor should it," she confided to her diary. Her grief was a physical force, a weight that crushed her spirit and stalled her work. She wrote of feeling stripped of all strength, of being a mother who could not, and would not, give up her sorrow. In one heart-wrenching entry, she wrestled with the purpose of her own survival. "I do not want to die. I do not want to go until I have faithfully made the most of my talent and cultivated the seed that was placed in me." This does not contradict the fact that I would have died, smilingly, for Peter. Oh, how gladly, how gladly. Peter was seed for the planting which should not have been ground. Her art became a language for a grief that society had little space for. In her powerful sculptures and prints, she gave a face to the silent, stoic suffering of mothers and wives. Her iconic sculpture, Mother with Her Dead Son, depicts a mother cradling her fallen child, not in a pose of heroic sacrifice, but in an embrace of profound, primal sorrow, a stark and honest counter-narrative to the state-sanctioned glorification of death. Kollwitz's experience, though articulated with the soul of an artist, echoed in the homes of ordinary women across the nation. They were expected to mourn with patriotic pride, to find solace in their husbands' or sons' ultimate sacrifice for the fatherland. But the reality was a brutal landscape of emotional and financial devastation. For the nearly 525,000 German women who became widows, grief was compounded by a sudden plunge into poverty. Pensions were often meager and tied to the husband's military rank, not his civilian income. 2/3 of these widows were under the age of 30, many with young children to support alone. Their lives became a relentless struggle for survival, a battle fought on a new, lonely front. The war had taken their partners, their sons, and their futures, leaving behind a silence that letters could no longer fill. The armistice is signed. The guns on the Western Front finally fall silent. For Germany, it's a moment of profound shock, humiliation, and chaos. The Kaiser has abdicated, an empire has crumbled, and in its place, a fragile republic is struggling to be born. Amidst this wreckage, you might think the story of women who had held the home front together would be one of triumph. You might think their reward for years of sacrifice would be a new era of freedom. And on the surface, it looked exactly like that. But the truth, as always, was far more complicated. On November 12, 1918, just days after the end of the war, the new provisional government did something revolutionary. It declared universal suffrage for all citizens over the age of 20, and for the first time in German history, that included women. After decades of struggle by feminist movements, the right to vote wasn't won through a gradual, hard-fought campaign. It was delivered almost overnight in the whirlwind of national collapse. For millions of women, it was a staggering victory. When the first elections for the new National Assembly were held in January 1919, they turned out in force. An incredible 82% of eligible women cast their ballots, and 37 were elected to Parliament, making up nearly 10% of the representatives. Imagine that moment. Marie Juchacz, a social democrat, becomes the first woman to ever address a German parliament. "What this government has done," she declared, "was a self-evident matter. It has given women what has been unjustly withheld from them until now." It felt like the dawn of a new age. The Weimar Constitution would go on to enshrine the principle of gender equality into law. On paper, German women were now among the most liberated in the world. But paper is not life. As the men returned from the front, broken, shell-shocked, and jobless, the national mood shifted. The cry was no longer for women's contribution, but for their retreat. The very same women who had been hailed as heroines of the home front were now seen as placeholders. Demobilization decrees were passed, forcing droves of women out of the factories, the offices, and the skilled positions they had occupied during the war to make way for the returning veterans. The trade unions, which had always been wary of female labor, now actively pushed them out, fearing they would undercut men's wages. For those who managed to keep their jobs, the promise of equality was a mirage. They were still paid significantly less than men for the same work. The Weimar Constitution might have promised equality, but it didn't bother to revise the old imperial civil code, which upheld the husband as the head of the family with control over all property. So women were left with a crushing, double burden: long hours in a low-wage job followed by the unpaid labor of running a household, caring for children, and tending to husbands physically and psychologically scarred by the war. Liberation felt less like freedom and more like exhaustion. Yet something had irrevocably changed. You couldn't just put the genie back in the bottle. In the bustling, chaotic cities of the Weimar Republic, especially Berlin, a new figure emerged, one that would both define and scandalize the era. The asterisk knew Frau Asterisk, the new woman. She was a cultural icon, an advertising fantasy, and for some, a lived reality. You've seen her image. She had short, bobbed hair called the asterisk Bubikopf asterisk, or boy's head. She smoked cigarettes in public, wore makeup, and favored more androgynous, masculine clothing. She was career-oriented, sexually liberated, and unapologetically independent. This new woman frequented the cabarets and nightclubs that pulsed with the frantic, creative energy of the 1920s. She was a symbol of modernity, a rejection of the old world of asterisk kinder, Kuch, Kirch asterisk, children, kitchen, church. But this new ideal was a battleground. For every woman who felt empowered by it, there were many more who saw it as a threat. Conservatives and traditionalists were horrified. They looked at the falling birth rate, which hit its lowest point in Berlin by 1932, and blamed the selfish, career-driven new woman. They pointed to rising divorce rates as proof that she was destroying the traditional family unit. In their eyes, she was a scapegoat for all of Germany's post-war problems. Its economic instability, its moral decay, its national humiliation. Even the political gains were double-edged. While women could vote, their presence in politics didn't fundamentally alter the patriarchal structure. Political parties courted the female vote, often by focusing on motherly issues and reinforcing the idea that a woman's primary role was to protect the family. The state itself was caught in a contradiction. On one hand, it championed social welfare programs, maternity leave, and health care to support mothers. But these pro-natalist policies were designed to boost the population for the good of the nation, not necessarily to liberate women as individuals. Access to contraception was limited, and abortion remained illegal, a constant reminder that a woman's body was not entirely her own. So did the war liberate German women? The answer is a fractured yes and a resounding no. They gained the vote, a political voice they had never known. They tasted new forms of economic and social independence. A vibrant, modern image of womanhood entered the public consciousness. But these gains were built on unstable ground. The economic reality for most was grim, the social backlash was fierce, and the legal promises of equality were often hollow. The liberation was partial, contested, and deeply paradoxical. It was a brief, dazzling flash of possibility in a society deeply scarred by its past and uncertain of its future. And as the Weimar Republic itself began to crumble, those fragile freedoms would be among the first casualties of the darkness to come. The war ended not with a triumphant parade, but with a deep collective sigh of exhaustion. For the women of Germany, who had shouldered the burden of the home front, the silence of the guns in November 1918 was supposed to herald a new beginning. They had run the factories, driven the trams, managed the farms, and nursed the wounded. They had proven themselves not just capable, but indispensable. They had earned their place in a new Germany, a nation they had held together with sheer grit. But the revolution they had lived was about to be unwritten. The new enemy wasn't a foreign power, it was peace itself. The return of millions of soldiers from the front created a seismic shockwave through German society. These were not the confident heroes who had marched off in 1914. They were broken, traumatized men returning to a defeated nation, a homeland they barely recognized. They needed jobs, they needed to reclaim their roles as providers, and they needed to restore a sense of order to a world that had spun off its axis. The fledgling Weimar government, grappling with economic collapse and political instability, saw a simple, if brutal, solution. The women had to go home. What followed was a swift and systematic campaign of demobilization targeting female workers. The very government that had pleaded for their labor now passed laws and issued decrees forcing them out of their jobs. The woman who had been hailed as a patriot for taking a man's place in a factory was now vilified as a *Doppelverdiener*, a double learner, selfishly clinging to a position that rightfully belonged to a returning veteran. It was a stunning betrayal, wrapped in the language of patriotic duty. "Your service is complete," the propaganda whispered, "now step aside." The pressure was immense, coming from all sides. Trade unions, once desperate for any available labor, now argued that women were taking bread out of the mouths of unemployed soldiers. Newspapers ran articles decrying the unnatural state of affairs, painting a picture of social decay caused by women who had abandoned their domestic duties. Politicians warned of a declining birth rate, linking it directly to female employment. Germany, they argued, needed to be rebuilt, repopulated, and that sacred task fell to women, not in the factory, but in the home, as wives and mothers. This wasn't just an economic policy. It was a deeply psychological war. For a soldier returning from the hellscape of the trenches, finding his wife or sister financially independent and self-sufficient could feel deeply unsettling. It was another sign of how the world had been turned upside down, another challenge to a masculinity already shattered by the trauma of war. The push to return women to the kitchen was, in many ways, a desperate attempt to turn back the clock, to restore the familiar, patriarchal order of the pre-war world as a balm for the nation's wounded pride. For millions of women, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The skills they had mastered, the autonomy they had gained, the camaraderie they had found in the workplace, all of it was being erased. While some women willingly returned to domestic life, exhausted by years of grueling labor and the double burden of work and family, many others were forced out, pushed back into economic dependence or into the precarious, low-wage world of domestic service. The brief, exhilarating moment of possibility, of expanded roles and proven equality, seemed to be closing like a fist. The revolution had been ignited in the crucible of war, but in the cold, harsh light of peace, it seemed it was being deliberately, methodically betrayed. So how did the story end for them? After the thunder of artillery faded and the men who survived began to trickle home, what became of the women who had held Germany together? Their world had been irrevocably altered. They had run farms, operated machinery, managed households on dwindling resources, and faced starvation and loss, emerging into a defeated, fractured nation that was barely recognizable. The reward for their immense sacrifice was, in many ways, a paradox. In the final, chaotic days of the German Empire, with revolution simmering in the streets, women were granted a right they had long fought for: the vote. On November 12, 1918, the provisional government declared universal suffrage, and suddenly these women were not just workers or mothers, but citizens with a political voice. In the first elections of the nascent Weimar Republic, the female turnout was massive, over 80%. They streamed to the polls, eager to shape the new Germany they had bled for. By 1920, over 100 women had been elected to the Reichstag, a level of representation that was astonishingly progressive for the time. This political leap forward gave rise to the idea of the new woman, an independent, working, modern figure who challenged traditional roles. She was depicted in magazines and films with short hair, a confident gaze, and a job in the city. And for a small, urban minority, this was a reality. The Weimar Constitution enshrined gender equality, granting women the right to work and making marriage an equal partnership in the eyes of the law. But for the vast majority, this new woman was a phantom, a glossy image that bore little resemblance to their daily struggles. The reality was that as soon as the war ended, the pressure for women to return to the domestic sphere was immense. Demobilization, laws were passed that ordered employers to fire women to make way for returning soldiers. The very jobs they had been praised for performing were now snatched away. Trade unions, dominated by men, resented what they called double earners, households where both husband and wife worked, and pushed women out of the workforce. Those who did keep their jobs were paid significantly less than their male counterparts for the same work. The promise of economic independence for many evaporated like a mirage. Society itself was deeply divided. While some celebrated the new freedoms, a powerful conservative backlash was brewing. Traditionalists, the clergy, and rising extremist parties vilified the new woman, blaming her for the falling birth rate and rising divorce rate that they saw as evidence of societal decay. They argued that women in the workplace were stealing jobs from men and destroying the fabric of the German family. Many women, exhausted by the dual burden of work and domestic duties, and nostalgic for a pre-war sense of order, even found themselves drawn to these conservative promises. This generation of women was caught in a brutal tug-of-war between newfound rights and deeply entrenched traditions. They had proven their strength, their resilience, their indispensability. They had managed farms alone, faced down hunger, and navigated the emotional minefield of long-distance relationships with husbands brutalized by the front. They had kept the country from collapsing, but the nation they saved was not always ready to thank them. Decades later, another image would emerge to define German womanhood, the Trümmerfrau asterisk, or rubble woman, heroically clearing the ruins of World War II. This narrative of women selflessly rebuilding the nation from literal ashes became a foundational myth for both West and East Germany. But recent historical work has shown this, too, is a simplified legend. While women certainly participated in the cleanup, the work was largely done by men and machines, and many of the women involved were forced into it as a form of penance for their association with the Nazi Party. The real story is quieter and far more profound. The true legacy of the women of World War I isn't found in a single, heroic image, but in the slow, grinding, and often contradictory progress they initiated. They were the first to vote, the first to sit in parliament in large numbers, the first to challenge the age-old decree that a woman's place was solely in the home. They didn't achieve a perfect, emancipated future overnight. They were pushed back, sidelined, and their contributions were often deliberately forgotten. But they cracked the foundation of the old patriarchal world. The generation that followed, and the one after that, would build on those cracks. The battles they fought for equal pay, for reproductive rights, for true partnership in marriage, were all continuations of a struggle that this forgotten generation of women began. They navigated the treacherous landscape of a post-war world with little recognition, caught between the memory of an empire and the chaotic birth of a republic. They didn't just endure history, they were shaped by it, and in turn, they shaped the Germany we know today, not through grand monuments, but through the quiet, revolutionary act of refusing to be invisible. And so, the story of German women in the First World War comes to a close. It began with a simple, restrictive slogan, asterisk kinder, Kuch, Kirch asterisk, but it ended in the deafening roar of the factory, the grim silence of the field hospital, and the desperate ingenuity of the turnip winter. We've seen how they transformed from the silent partners of an empire into its very backbone. They were the asterisk munitionette who armed the nation while sacrificing their own health, the managers of a home front collapsing under starvation, and the Schwestern who faced the war's unimaginable carnage with stoicism and skill. The war didn't ask for their permission. It demanded their sacrifice. It forced them out of the home and into the heart of the national struggle, testing their endurance in ways their society had never thought possible. The old world of domesticity wasn't just paused, it was irrevocably shattered. When German women finally won the right to vote in 1919, it wasn't a gift from a grateful nation. It was a debt finally paid, a right earned in the toxic dust of munitions plants, in the endless hunger queues, and in the blood and tears of the makeshift wards. They didn't just keep the home fires burning, they forged the very shells that fed the war and bore the hunger that defined the peace. If this deep dive into the lives of Germany's wartime women moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. And if you believe these forgotten narratives deserve to be told, make sure you subscribe to Untold Women History ***, so you don't miss our next journey into the past.